I walked to my desk this morning and opened my laptop, and I heard this voice. If you tell them, they will come. I was like, okay. It's kind of weird, but I recognize that this voice was referring to you, my audience, and how if you like the show, you can help expand its reach. If you tell others, if you leave a review on iTunes or wherever you listen, if you donate through the Patron program on Podbean or on my website, midnightlibraryofbaseball.com, you'll be helping me get to a place where I can devote more time and energy so you can continue to receive a high-quality product. Eventually, I'd like to do longer shows more frequently, and with your help, I'll get there. Okay, here's the show. Chew, dip, ST, or smokeless tobacco. Probably the most recognizable substance linked to Major League Baseball. You couldn't watch a baseball movie or turn over a baseball card from the 60s, 70s, and 80s without seeing at least one player with a giant bulge in his cheek, or the endless spitting that came as an unsavory byproduct of the habit. If you recall the baseball scene from The Naked Gun, you probably remember the hilarious and disgusting spitting scene. Probably the most famous baseball death linked to chewing tobacco is Babe Ruth, who died at the age of 53. However, some new research suggests that Ruth may have died from a different type of cancer. Still, there are plenty of other baseball deaths or illnesses linked to smokeless tobacco. Hall of Fame hitter Tony Gwynn cited his years of dip as the cause of his terminal diagnosis, which led to his death at the age of 54. And other players like Curt Flood and Bill Tuttle also died from cancers linked to smokeless tobacco, while Curt Schilling and Brett Butler were diagnosed with oral cancer that they linked to chew. In today's podcast, I'm going to address and answer several questions. 1. Why was chewing tobacco so enormously popular during the early years of baseball? 2. How did something so popular nearly vanish in a flash by 1900? And 3. How did something so enormously unpopular and dangerous make such a startling comeback? So much so that by the 1980s, nearly 50% of Major League players chewed, and the number was still as high as 43% by 1990. Tonight, the long and fascinating history of tobacco and baseball. You're listening to the Midnight Library of Baseball, where there are no loud noises, no jarring music, only nostalgic, thought-provoking, emotional stories about baseball. I'm Ben Orlando. Of all the habits associated with sports, tobacco seems to come with the most viscerally repellent, unappealing side effects or byproducts, be it smoke or smokeless. But these byproducts only highlight the addictive nature of the product itself. Bill Tuttle, a ball player who chewed tobacco for 40 years and lost his jaw to oral cancer, still said, quote, "If they assured me I had a 100% chance of not getting cancer again, I'd have some chew in my mouth tomorrow," end quote. To begin, let's clarify the difference in products. There's of course cigarettes, cigars, and pipes. There's chewing tobacco, or chew, which is a loose-leaf tobacco cured and fermented and cut into strips or strands. You place a portion in your mouth and chew it slowly to release the flavors. Dip, on the other hand, is finely ground and moist, and you typically pack a portion of this in your cheek or lower lip, where it sits and the flavor and nicotine seep into your mouth. And what makes the process visually unappealing is the fact that you don't just swallow the substance, you have to expectorate or spit out the tobacco. In a way, chewing tobacco is an act of colonial individuation, a country and people separating from their former overseers. In England, the custom of tobacco consumption was through pipe, and later through the sniffing of finely ground tobacco called snuff. But America, in establishing its own norms in an act of colonial defiance, decided to chew. In 1842, around the time the first recognizable game of baseball was played, British novelist Charles Dickens traveled to the United States and commented on the ubiquity of chewing tobacco. He visited a medical college where signs requested that students, quote, expectorate into designated boxes so as not to discolor the stairs, end quote. Dickens also attended a trial where everyone, the judge, jury, spectators, and defendants, had their own spittoons. This was not the Wild West. In the mid-1800s in America, chewing tobacco could be found at all levels of society and was already widely popular across the nation as baseball expanded. But players began to find additional reasons to chew. On dry summer ball fields, chewing tobacco encouraged saliva production and lubricated the mouth. It also gave you something to do while you were standing around, waiting for some action. From former ballplayer Tony Oliva, quote, when you play the game, you have to have something to entertain you. Otherwise, your brain goes crazy, end quote. And when gloves became more common in the 1870s and 80s, players used tobacco spit to lubricate the leather in the hot and dry weather. And of course, pitchers used the juices to create more action on the balls. For instance, the spitball, which was used to tremendous effect by hundreds of pitchers until it was finally banned in 1920. Not only would a spitball move differently through the air, but mixed with dirt, it was harder to see, and part of the ban was due to Ray Chapman's death, when he was hit by a pitch he didn't see coming. By the late 1800s, Americans could not get enough of chewing tobacco. According to Brian Palmer in his Slate article on the topic, quote, the chewing habit hit its high water mark in 1890, when the average American gnawed through more than 3 pounds of tobacco, end quote. With such a widespread, enormous daily consumption, it seemed like the sales of chewing tobacco would continue to grow. But something came along to upend this budding trend: tuberculosis. Although it's not that tuberculosis came along, only that the link appeared between TB and tobacco. In the 19th century, tuberculosis was a ravaging disease. Caused by bacteria, TB attacked the lungs, tissue, brain, bones, really most areas of the body, leading to death if untreated. How deadly was tuberculosis? According to PBS's American Experience, quote, by the dawn of the 19th century, tuberculosis, or consumption, had killed 1 in 7 of all people that had ever lived, end quote. 1 in 7 of all people that had ever lived. People typically died from the disease, and those who didn't could not return to a normal life. One of the pioneers of TB research was German microbiologist Robert Koch, who dispelled the myth that TB was genetic. Instead, Koch said TB was highly contagious and highly preventable through good hygiene. Additionally, Koch reported that spitting greatly increased the spread of the disease. With his announcement, you can almost hear the record player screeching to a halt. Quickly throughout the world, especially in the United States, cities passed anti-spitting laws and removed spittoons from public spaces. No spitting meant no chew. Just like that, chewing tobacco virtually disappeared from urban areas. But there were still many other forms of tobacco. By this time, tobacco in smoke form had been present in baseball for at least a half a century. Specifically, cigars. According to author Kevin Grace, amateur teams in the 1830s and 40s celebrated at ceremonial dinners using quote-unquote victory cigars. And as early as the 1860s, a company called Cuban Star Cigars had images of baseball on their boxes. It's amazing to think that baseball itself went all the way back to 1860, let alone was linked to cigars at such an early time in history. Cigarettes at this time were all hand-rolled and were considered, according to Grace, quote, the province of poor men, foreigners, soldiers, and effete artist types and social radicals from the lower classes, end quote. But this all changed during the Civil War, which lasted from 1861 to 1865. During this time, soldiers were exposed to the cigarette, and specifically, Northern soldiers were exposed to the sweeter tobacco of the South. They developed a taste for it. In 1880, the Bonsack cigarette machine was invented, which eliminated the need for hand rolling and significantly increased output capabilities while significantly decreasing the price. People smoked a massive amount of tobacco, which makes sense when you think of the function of nicotine to relax you, to calm your nerves. In truth, nicotine does momentarily relax you, but it quickly gives way to withdrawal symptoms and cravings for more nicotine, more cigarettes, making you more anxious and on edge most of the time, until you have the next cigarette. And we're talking about living in the 1800s, in many ways for most people, a brutal existence. It makes sense that they'd latch on to any product that could ease or provide the illusion of easing their day-to-day struggles. And since baseball players at this time made little to no money, their struggles would have been sizable. In the baseball world, players did smoke, but many were skeptical of the impact of cigarettes on their performance. Famous ball player turned preacher, Billy Sunday, railed in the 1890s against the ills of tobacco, and specifically cigarettes. He said of his former White Sox teammate, John Clarkson, quote, poor John died up in Massachusetts in an insane asylum. Cigarettes broke down his health. I have known him to smoke 8 and 10 boxes of them a day. I used to room with John. The water would be stained with nicotine when he'd take a bath, end quote. And according to Brian Palmer, the decline in 1892 of one of the best players in the game, Michael King Kelly, was linked to Kelly smoking cigarettes in the outfield. This anti-cigarette fervor carried into the 20th century. Industrialist Henry Ford adamantly railed against cigarettes, writing numerous pamphlets, and would not employ cigarette smokers. Ford also solicited help from famous people of the day, including ballplayers. Famous manager Connie Mack said, quote, there is very little cigarette smoking among our baseball boys. No boy or man can expect to succeed in high positions in the world and continue the use of cigarettes, end quote. And from Washington Senators manager Clark Griffith, quote, our failure to come up to expectations has been largely due to the fact that some of the players on whom we depended were cigarette fiends, end quote. And from Ty Cobb, quote, too much cannot be said against the evils of cigarette smoking, end quote. Although Cobb had previously endorsed several tobacco brands. Despite these efforts to condemn cigarettes, compared side by side, smokeless tobacco has been found to be more harmful than cigarettes, with 28 cancer-causing agents and more nicotine preserving than cigarettes. One average portion of chew kept in the mouth for 30 minutes is equal to smoking 3 cigarettes, and many players kept smokeless tobacco in their mouths for many, many hours. Bill Tuttle, who again lost most of his jaw and then his life to tobacco, supposedly chewed for 40 years, for as long as 10 to 12 hours per day. If you knew Tuttle, you might have thought the bulge in his cheek was permanent. So in the first years of the 20th century, you have the tuberculosis scare and many anti-cigarette advocates. But you also have Big Tobacco continuing to find creative ways to spread the word about their products, like baseball cards. When we think of baseball cards, we usually think of chewing gum, But baseball cards weren't packaged with chewing gum until the 1930s, when Fleer and the Gowdy Gum Company began combining the two. By 1888, tobacco companies were inserting small cards with images of baseball players as a means to add some stiffness to their packages of loose-leaf tobacco. These were tiny cards, 1 7/16 by 2 5/8, about the size of a box of matches or a Zippo lighter. And they would go on to add these cards to cigarette packs. One of the most famous baseball cards in history, the Honus Wagner card from 1909, sold in 2022 for $7.25 million, was a T card or tobacco card. And now what starts to happen is that you have these kids who idolize these players wanting to get a hold of these baseball cards. But to do so, they have to get a hold of tobacco. This very same card of Honus Wagner was apparently disputed by Honus Wagner, who didn't want to be included in the set produced by the American Tobacco Company. Wagner was a frequent user of tobacco products, but he said he had a problem using his image to sell cigarettes to children. In addition to baseball cards, the tobacco industry came up with other ways to market their product to the baseball world. In 1912, the Bull Durham Tobacco Company created an ad campaign by erecting huge billboards in ballpark outfields, with rewards of $50 for any ball player who hit the signs. In 1912, $50 would have been equal to more than $1,000 today. These Bull Durham signs became ubiquitous, seen throughout ballparks across the country. And later, the areas where pitchers warmed up were often next to or near these signs, hence the name bullpen. I find it interesting that one company in the early days of the 1900s, Mail Pouch Chewing Tobacco, tried to draw on the distant glory days of baseball to promote their product. From Kevin Grace, quote, "Mail Pouch used an ad that played upon baseball's heritage, referring to the golden times of the game's early days," end quote. I can just picture old men in 1903 or 1904 complaining about the ugly modernization of the game, and how things were so much better in the 1860s and 70s. I wonder what they would think if they caught a glimpse of what baseball has become. If you like the show and crave more content, you can become a Patreon member, where you'll have access to additional audio episodes, video interviews, and other articles and images linked to the show. Go to Patreon/Midnight Library of Baseball. And since this is a one-man production, every bit of support helps. You can donate at midnightlibraryofbaseball.com, and you can add reviews on iTunes and Spotify. Okay, back to the show. In the ebb and flow battle between chew and cigarettes in baseball, cigarettes gained in popularity in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. According to historian Martha Gardner, only 2% of Americans smoked cigarettes in 1900, and the majority of tobacco consumption was through other means. Tuberculosis and Dr. Koch's warnings did decrease chewing tobacco usage in baseball, but it didn't completely disappear, as ball players still needed a fix and were reluctant to smoke. And in the 1910s and 20s, tuberculosis was still a real threat, and hence so was spitting. In fact, one of the baseball legends, Christy Mathewson, died of tuberculosis in 1925. But another part of this trend away from chewing tobacco had to do with the perception of chewing tobacco and the cigarette industry's success in glamorizing cigarettes. From Kevin Grace, quote, "Part of the reason was laid at the door of aesthetics, with the mess and image of spitting tobacco juice as socially disgusting," end quote. According to Grace, it was the influence of women and their disgust of the habit that pushed their men away from chewing tobacco and towards cigarettes. During this time, all the biggest names promoted cigarettes: Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Joe DiMaggio, Ted Williams, Willie Mays, and hundreds of others. In the 1930s, Camel ran ad campaigns with the slogan, quote, "It takes healthy nerves," end quote, meaning, to play the game and be a winner, you need to calm your nerves. Again, this is ironic considering cigarettes actually make a person overall more anxious. Camel also claimed in their ads in the 1930s that 21 of 23 New York Giants World Series champions smoked Camels. In 1934, it was 21 out of 23 St. Louis Cardinals. In terms of societal pressure, it would have been hard to go against the grain when you see these kinds of numbers. And as a kid or adult, you see almost all of your idols smoking cigarettes or promoting cigarettes. Another popular Camel slogan was, quote, "They don't get your wind," end quote, as in, you don't get winded when you smoke our cigarettes, which was a direct argument against the common fear among athletes that your lungs are going to suffer if you smoke. By the 1950s, 45% of Americans smoked cigarettes, and cigarettes represented 81% of tobacco consumption. It's understandable that people could have continued to smoke for so long without recognizing its consequences. But it's harder to believe elite athletes with fine-tuned radars when it came to their abilities could not notice the effects of cigarettes. These are players who are paying attention to their bodies, every little change, all the time. And yet, for decades, players continued to smoke. As late as the 80s and 90s, some players, like Keith Hernandez and Charlie Huff, were still smoking during games, although they had to retreat to the tunnels or clubhouse or bullpen. And some managers, like Sparky Anderson and Jim Leland, tried to get away with smoking in the dugout as much as possible. But for the most part, players smoking during games and on the field hasn't been a thing for a very long time. And by the 1960s, because of new studies and the Surgeon General declaring cigarettes linked to death and disease, the baseball world once again leaned heavily on smokeless tobacco, with Big Tobacco delivering free samples of dip to baseball clubhouses everywhere. Remember, you didn't have to chew dip. You simply put it in your mouth and let it do the work. Change finally came in Major League Baseball due to advocacy work by players like Bill Tuttle, who linked up with Mickey Mantle and other stars to spread the word on the dangers of chew, dip, and tobacco overall. Tuttle went around speaking to major and minor league teams, sometimes barely able to talk because of the surgeries on his face. In 1993, Major League Baseball banned the use of tobacco in all minor league stadiums. In 2012, restrictions were placed on visibility. Basically, players were not allowed to be seen using smokeless tobacco on camera or by fans. Then, in 2014, one of the best and well-liked players in baseball, Tony Gwynn, died at the age of 54 from salivary gland cancer, which Gwynn openly attributed to his years of using smokeless tobacco. Finally, in 2016, Major League Baseball banned tobacco use by any new players. Yeah, that's right. Just like the spitball rules of the 1920s and helmet mandates of the 1970s, the grandfather clause was once again brought back, meaning that any players who began their MLB careers before 2016 were still allowed to use chew on the field. However, COVID put an end to this practice, with total restrictions of tobacco products in 2020. But this doesn't mean that nicotine is gone from the game. Today, players are turning to nicotine pouches made by various companies. The pouches are the size of Reese's Pieces and contain no tobacco, but are just as addictive. They come in small plastic containers in various flavors. One company sold 6 million cans in 2019, with a 516% increase 2 years later. Because these products are so new, there's not a lot of research on health risks for such high-level nicotine intake, but the levels are high. One baseball player reported popping 3 to 4 pouches into his mouth at a time, and doing this 4 to 5 times a day, saying his use was about normal compared to his teammates. This adds up to about 90 milligrams of nicotine per day. For a comparison, the average cigarette has between 10 and 12 milligrams of nicotine. So players are ingesting the equivalent of 9 cigarettes worth of nicotine per day. And just for a refresher, nicotine itself is not a carcinogen, meaning it doesn't cause cancer like so many of the chemicals in cigarettes and smokeless tobacco. But nicotine can cause an increase in blood pressure, heart rate, a narrowing of the arteries, and can cause the hardening of arterial walls. Doctors recommend people to wean themselves off nicotine entirely, but for now, nicotine, at least, is here to stay in Major League Baseball. And for all of you listening who thought the age of spitting had ended, yes and no. Clearly, based on this episode, there's a clear reason why players spit: tobacco. And this seems to be the dominant culprit. But writer James Llewellyn in his research found, quote, the need to spit as a result of excessive movement during a sport that causes the body to produce high levels of protein. That thicker protein makes saliva thicker and harder to swallow, thus creating the need or desire to spit. End quote. By this reasoning, you would think players in all sports would be spitting. But Llewellyn made the logical point that players in other sports with more excessive movement, like basketball and tennis, do not spit. Remember, as Tony Oliva said, ball players have to chew on something to keep them from going crazy during the game. And another popular thing to chew is sunflower seeds, which were chewed by Stan Musial and Enos Slaughter, but really took off after Reggie Jackson. And sunflower seeds might require more spitting than tobacco. There's also the culture of spitting in the game, and the long history of not only chewing and spitting tobacco, but pitchers spitting on their baseballs and players spitting in their gloves. I've never said spit so many times in a podcast. James Llewellyn wrote, quote, I have no empirical stats to back this up, but the floor of a Major League Baseball team's dugout has to be the most unhealthy, bacteria-filled surface in the entire sporting world. End quote. However, this trend should have stopped. In 2020, at the height of COVID, Major League Baseball banned spitting by baseball players, coaches, and managers, which means you shouldn't see players spitting anymore. Is this true? Let me know what you see in spring training. But it does seem like the century-old marriage of tobacco and baseball has finally come to an end. As for spitting, when players like Rafael Devers step to the plate, their cheeks bulging with something, you may still need to avert your eyes or wear a raincoat. That's the show. You can find the podcast at my website, midnightlibraryofbaseball.com, and you can subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, Google Podcasts, and a variety of other platforms. You can also find me on Instagram, Midnight Library of Baseball, and on Facebook. The music is A Long Way by Sergei Pavkin at Pixabay. Good night.